Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Spelman, and I'm an agronomy educator at Penn State Extension, and I'm joined here with my co-host and colleague, Justin Brackenridge. Justin, how are you doing today?
Good, Ryan. How are you doing?
Oh, I am living the dream. I guess it's September 25th today. I had to look at my calendar there to remember, but we have rain. So it's been a while since we've had rain. I've kind of forgot what that feels like. But it's been a nice break from being outside, and we've been getting a lot done inside. And luckily, we had a lot of silage harvest that was done prior to some of this rain. And that's what our episode is going to be about today. I think this topic is well overdue. In Pennsylvania, we're a big silage producing state. For me, being in the central west region of the state, a lot of our agriculture does support the dairy and beef industry. So we produce a lot of silage. So it's amazing we haven't talked about it yet. I'm really excited for this topic. We have on Joe Lawrence out of Cornell University to talk about this. Justin, anything that you want to bring up before we bring Joe on?
Well, you know how I feel. The more about forages and animal livestock, the happier I am, right? So we could do silage and hay and pasture all the time, and I would be content. But I agree. I think, we kind of need to not forget about these folks out here making some silage, some haylage, some of the other things that we've got. And we were talking before this podcast got started, you and Joe and I, about kind of different sides of a coin between last year and this year. And when we started setting this up, we were thinking, mid to late September, we would be kind of getting going compared to where we were last year. And here we are talking about at the tail end. So we're lucky to have Joe, and he's going to tell us all of the things we can learn from an accelerated harvest and what we can do to maybe improve on this next year.
Awesome. Yeah. So, Joe, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what your background is and your role at Cornell?
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to join today, guys. And it is a big topic. I mean, New York and Pennsylvania are both certainly known for the dairy industry as well as other livestock. So, uh, yeah, I grew up on a small dairy farm in northern New York, right along the St. Lawrence River, and took a kind of roundabout path back into agriculture, but ended up with a degree in agronomy and then going to grad school. Actually, then I was focused more on nutrient management and worked a lot with manure management, nitrogen management on corn. And then I had the opportunity to join a cooperative extension here in New York at the county level and Lewis County, New York, which is in the northern part of the state, and worked there as a field crops educator for several years, and then spent a few years in the private sector working as a nutrient management planner and crop consultant. And then in 2016, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to join the Cornell PRO-DAIRY program, which is a statewide extension and applied research program. So my official title, I guess, there is Dairy Forage Systems Specialist, kind of a long title, but throughout my career, coming from an agronomy background, but joining extension in a very dairy heavy county, and quickly recognized, obviously the importance of forages, but not only that, but kind of sometimes a bit of a disconnect between growing the crop and feeding the crop. So I don't say this with any disrespect, but I kind of jokingly say that, what the agronomists would help plan out the fertilizer, seeding rates, all the traditional agronomy stuff, get the crop in the ground, get the weeds killed, and then, all right, our job's done here. And then the nutritionist would pick up the sample at the bunk and have it analyzed for quality and figure out what they were gonna do to feed it. And at that time period, this is back several years ago now, so it's changed a lot. There's a lot more recognition of forage management now, but at that time, there wasn't as much focus on those in between stages. How do we dial in harvest management, making sure we're ensiling it properly, and making sure a good quality feed is reaching the cow. So so I kind of fell into it that way and just had a real interest in the topic, and it fits well with this job. And that's where I kind of describe myself now, is kind of spending half of my time working with the agronomy side of things and the other half working with silage management, feed management, that sort of thing. I'm not a nutritionist. I know enough about nutrition to be dangerous maybe, but work a lot with the nutrition community and the farms on how we're utilizing these forages.
So while Joe was talking, I was doing my Google researching here. So while we keep talking about how important this is to Pennsylvania, and we keep talking about its importance to New York and stuff, and right now, estimated Pennsylvania is producing somewhere just north of 900,000 acres of corn. And about 300,000 of that is going for corn silage, right? So about a third of all of the corn production we're going through is for corn silage, right? So, in theory, that means a third of all of the information we should be producing should be going to corn. And I don't think that's nearly the case, right? And looking at some other stuff, New York is somewhere about 430,000. Does that sound right to you, Joe?
That would yeah, we're that would just be silage, I think.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
just their
yeah.
silage production.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we've been yeah, we're actually our numbers are fairly similar. Plus or minus 1 million acres of total corn, but we're
Okay.
more 50-50
Okay.
silage and grain. So you referenced about a third on your end, but we're generally about 50-50. So
So this is a
yeah.
big substantial part that somehow from the Penn State side of it, we can say kind of falls in the crack between the grain specialist and the forage specialist,
Mhm.
right? Like that's not a knock against our specialists by any means, but like it's kind of this weird thing that's its own, right? It's not, you can't lump it with one person or the other. You kind of have to be good at this one thing to be able to do it. Just like you said, agronomists can do all this other, but you need to be a silage person.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. And me and Justin have talked about this quite a bit on this podcast as well. That one, not just because Justin has this interest in forages and has an animal science background, but really bridging that gap, as Joe, you kind of mentioned, that somehow we tend to silo both of these topics out, but really it's all one thing, right? It's the same thing just with grain and corn, right? And there are going to be different considerations for that corn as a forage compared to if you're producing a grain. So, could you talk a little bit about maybe what your current research and interest in this pro dairy role that you're in now?
Yeah, so a big part of it is corn silage, and as you mentioned, it is kind of we have some very good forage specialists at Cornell, as you guys do as well, but there is sometimes more focus on perennial forages, which is obviously very important, but corn silage is certainly and we call it a forage, even though some people argue that, but we call it a forage, and it's a very important part of our diets. And so that has been a big part of this position. When I took the position in 2016, I was kind of tasked with restarting our corn silage hybrid trials, which I know you guys have a robust program through PDMP and collaboration with Penn State in Pennsylvania. And so I relaunched that program. It had been on hiatus for a few years, and we've had good support from the industry to enter hybrids into the program each year, and I've really tried to make the program about gleaning as much additional information as we can. So we go to all this work to plant all these hybrids and replicated trials, and we produce a publicly available extension report on how they perform side by side next to each other. In addition to that, we've had the opportunity to use that as a platform to look at some other management considerations. And one area that has really been of interest to me is how the weather impacts, especially fiber digestibility. We continue to see where the nutrition community has made some huge advancements in understanding fiber digestibility in the last couple of decades, and that's really shifted how they balance rations for cows. And we see that outside of like a BMR, brown midrib corn, which is higher digestibility. Outside of that, when we're just looking at non-BMR hybrids, there's much bigger differences in fiber digestibility between locations, really driven by the growing environment versus what we see between a bunch of different hybrids grown at the same location. And so that's been a big interest of mine. Well, I know we're going to get into this more later in the podcast, but it really brings up to me the opportunity to look at the growing season we're having and using that to help kind of predict what that crop is going to feed like in the coming year. And we tend to see where wetter growing seasons reduce fiber digestibility. So if we have a real wet growing season, we can start predicting in August, even before the crop's harvested, if it's gonna maybe feed not as well as the previous year's crop. And that's an opportunity to start thinking about how you might have to adjust the rations, what ingredients you might have to bring into the farm to make up for those differences in quality when you start feeding the new crop. So that's been a big area of interest of mine, and we've tried to use the trials as a platform to do that, and that's included a lot of partnerships with Penn State and the PDMP program to expand out the data set. So it gives us the opportunity to look at hybrids, the same hybrids grown across both states and actually into Vermont too, because we partner with the University of Vermont. And so we can get a big range in locations and the type of growing season they had. I know I rambled on a little bit about that, but so that's been a big part of my program. In addition, I mentioned, the silage side before. So we do a lot of programming around silage management, especially with bunk silos. And we've also had some projects where we looked at characteristics of corn hybrids and how it affects kernel processing. So kernel processing is a big deal to unlock that starch in the silage. And we were interested in what growers and custom harvesters needed to really look at and consider when adjusting their kernel processors based on characteristics of the silage. So dry matter, one thing that we found to be a big deal was ear to stover ratio. So if you have a big, tall, leafy plant, it makes it more challenging to process those kernels, which makes sense, right? You have a lot more volume of material going through the machine, so it makes it a little more challenging to process the kernels. But so those are a few examples of this sort of paths we've been going down, trying to help farmers improve their management.
So Joe, I was taking some notes in here, and one of the points that we really want to hit, because we might be a little late, is things that we did in 24 that we can improve in 25. And you say we, right? We can estimate what this is going to do, or we can estimate what quality this is going to be in 2025, or in August, but depending on the weather. I made a note here, but I want you to kind of make sure we hit on this: is who is we, and what tools and tests do the farmers or the other people need to start thinking about that next year, right? Because we're always trying to figure that out. But I think that's great information, and great that we're always looking at that. But I'm not sure how many of us know that we can start making decisions in August for that type of situation.
Yeah, so I guess the collective we there, we don't, when I say we can predict this, it's not that we have a level of accuracy where we're going to use some sort of model to say exactly what your digestibility is in that silage. It's more of a relative scale, where you can look at last year's in the growing environment. And this is something we actually release as a short article with our corn silage trials that each year is we show the proportion of samples in our trials and where they fell in terms of the digestibility of the fiber. So using metrics like NDF 30-hour values or the UNDF 240-hour value, and tracking that over the years. So it's not super, we don't need super complex data or computer analysis. It's really more just, observational of we're experiencing a dry season like you guys had much of the state this year, or excessively wet like we had in a lot of northern New York this year. And using those observations and reflecting back on last year's growing season. So to give yourself a relative scale of, is this going to be feed better or worse than last year? And by doing that, I would encourage a grower to have a conversation with their nutritionist, right around that time to say, this is what we're kind of expecting. We had a drier year last year, which might have hurt yields, but actually probably helped fiber digestibility. And we've seen that we can feed more of this. We can include more of this corn silage in the diet, and they're just eating it because it's really highly digestible. And so now we're coming into a season that was wetter than average, and we would expect that to drag down our digestibility, which means when we start feeding that new crop, we're going to have, we're probably going to not be able to put as many pounds of it into the ration because the cows just aren't going to be able to consume the same amount of dry matter from it. So if we have to pull out a couple pounds of corn silage, what do we have to do to adjust that ration? And hey, maybe there's even an opportunity in August or early September to say, we know we're going to need more of this ingredient going for the next year. Maybe there's a good buy on it now and we can lock in some extra tons of it in August or September versus waiting till December or January and realizing we need to really change the diet around and be scrambling to find the ingredients we need.
So no matter what we do, we can't get away from good record keeping, it sounds, right? We've got to know some of the things that are going on our farm all the time so that we can kind of look at last year's and look at, 10 years ago or 5 years ago and see how things fed and see the weather. And that's always going to be important to us no matter what we're doing.
Absolutely. And I encourage taking green samples at harvest too. Grab some. Not only it can serve two purposes. One, it starts that conversation with your nutritionist of what this new crop is going to look like and feed like. And two, if you take the samples at harvest, you're more likely to know what field they came out of. Where when you go back, in February or April to take samples out to balance your diet, you may have a relative idea of where in the silo you are, but you don't know exactly what field that came out of. So I think taking some green samples at harvest, getting them analyzed, is a big benefit.
So I think this chat about taking samples here kind of leads to a next question about silage production here. When we're talking about kind of contrary to a lot of different forages, we're not just talking about that plant material, what's in that plant material, right? We have to go through the process of ensiling it and then feeding it out. So can you walk us through, at least from your perspective, and this might be a little bit of a loaded question, but when you take some corn tissue and you analyze it, first of all, what are some of these parameters you're looking for? And then how do you translate to this to, okay, I have these NDF values, these plant tissue measurements, but now I need to square that with what's my ensiling technique? How productive is this fermentation going to be, and what is that product going to look at by the time I'm feeding? How do you square all that information, and how do some of these other factors influence taking that material through to feed? That makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but it's a very important part of it. So I like to say that what really matters is that the tons of feed and the quality of that feed, not when it leaves the field, but when it reaches the cow's mouth, right? What do I mean by that? A couple of things. One is the ensiling process, fermentation. If we're not doing that correctly, we can have pretty substantial shrink losses of that feed. So you could have a really high tonnage leaving the field, but unfortunately, we still see where in a bunk silo hasn't been managed real well, we could have, 30 to 40% shrink of that feed. That's lost material that never reaches the cow's mouth. And even in our best case scenarios, it might be 10 or 15% shrink. So when you start thinking about the tons that left the field, if only, 75% of those are actually reaching the cow, that's your actual yield, right? Not the tons out of the field. And from a quality standpoint too, there's pros and cons to fermentation and siling. It's a really good way to store feed. It stabilizes the feed. The fermentation process can actually help unlock some nutrients in the feed. But on the flip side, we do burn up dry matter through the fermentation process. There are opportunities for things to go wrong and for losses to occur, or for you know mold development, or wild yeast or something like that to expand, which can reduce the palatability of that feed coming out of storage. So again, we could have something really promising coming out of the field and end up with a much compromised product that actually reaches the cow. So uh, that's, I think the overview of it is what we want to think about our goals being is ultimately the goal of how many tons of feed do we have to use, to put in the feed bunk in front of the animal. And to get there, yeah, corn's a unique beast. It's, about, on a dry matter basis, it's about half stover and half ear. And so it's essentially, I say it's an over mature grass with a grain on it, right? um and that's where we get that value from. So some of the big metrics we're looking at, because it's considered an energy source because of the starch in those kernels, we're looking at starch content and starch and the digestibility of that starch. And we're looking at, in any forage these days, we're looking at the fiber digestibility part of it. So, those are two of the biggest metrics. I mean, certainly a nutritionist is gonna, there's some crude protein in corn, but it's relatively low compared to what we get from our perennial forages. But obviously whatever's in there is going to be factored into the diet. But yeah, the starch and the fiber are the big ones. And the starch is an interesting one. Starch content is it's a percentage, so it's essentially a percent of that whole sample that's starch. And oftentimes we think ear size has a big influence on starch content, and it does to some extent, but actually what has a bigger influence is ear to stover ratio. So if you have a big, tall, leafy plant, you could have the same size ear on it as a shorter stature dual purpose plant, but you're going to have a lower starch content simply because it's diluted out by more stover. And that's something that I think is interesting to look at as well, as the Minor Institute, which is a ag research institute up here in New York. They put out a spreadsheet and have done some work, and they talk about like tons per acre of digestible nutrients. So if you look at, you could have two different plants with very different statures, and the shorter statured plant with the same size ear is going to have a higher starch content because it's a higher percentage of the whole. But in terms of, if you wanted to look at it and say, how many tons of starch per acre am I harvesting from this field, then they're going to be equal to each other if they have the same size ear. It's just one is bringing more plant material along with it as well. So those are the sort of things that we like to look at, and certainly we're going to dial in on that. The next thing that we would go to with starch is the digestibility of that starch. So we start with how much of it is there, the content, or how much starch is coming out of the field in those kernels. And then how digestible is that to the animal? And that's a unique thing about fermenting a corn silage is the fermentation process is shown to make that digestibility of that starch higher. So we generally recommend to allow corn silage to ferment much longer than we would say a hay crop silage. So the actual fermentation process, if it's an efficient fermentation, it goes well, that could be a 45-day process. And when you have a hay crop or even the corn silage, within 45 to 60 days of ensiling, you essentially have a stable feed stuff if the fermentation processes went well.
Basically, from a 30,000 foot, what that kind of encompasses is we're taking this small kind of chopped up material, we're packing it down, we're letting some microbial processes do their thing. They're causing it to go anaerobic, meaning no oxygen. That process causes the pH to drop, right? And so there's some other phases involved, but really the overall goal of this is causing this lower pH and this production of some of those carbohydrates into like lactic acid and acetic acid, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of the down and dirty part of ensiling is to what we want. But there are negative things too, right? We can get, and I'll embarrass myself on this podcast, but butyric is a bad one, right?
Yeah.
There are these foul other bad things that we can get when some of these anti-quality factors that we've talked about, like you've mentioned moisture, you've mentioned um, um, more cob or less cob. Like there are a lot of these other things that can lead to this ensiling not working so well. Shortening it up, not going the full 45 days if you have to get in there too early, right?
Right.
All of those things are kind of part of that factor too, right?
Yeah. Right. And the 45 days is if it's really truly been an efficient fermentation. So yeah, there's multiple phases. Our first goal is to push all the oxygen out of it because there are some aerobic bacteria in there that will continue to consume carbohydrates or the feed if there's still oxygen. That's essentially composting, right? We turn compost to introduce oxygen to keep those aerobic bacteria breaking down the material. Well, we don't want that to happen with our silage, so we want to push all the oxygen out, get past that aerobic phase into that anaerobic phase, as you mentioned, Justin, and then that's where we see uh, those bacteria in essence that over time they kind of pickle themselves, so they feed off the sugars, the energy, and the silage, and byproducts of that are acids that lower the pH. So eventually first you run out of oxygen, you turn anaerobic, and then you have those anaerobic bacteria that are producing acids as a byproduct and lowering the pH on themselves to the point where they can no longer survive, and that at which point you have a stable feed, and that's where, right, to get to, again, if it goes very efficiently, that 45 days, 60 days out, hopefully you've reached that point of stable feed, where there's no more activity going on there, and there won't be until oxygen is introduced again. And just to tie that back into the corn silage, so even after it reaches that stable phase, we continue to see an improvement in starch digestibility out for several months. So our guidelines for corn silage are ideally you would wait 3 to 4 months to start feeding that. It's not because the feed isn't stable. It's stable. It was stable after a month and a half or 2 months, but it's really unlocking that extra digestibility and that starch and getting the full value of that out of the corn silage is waiting that extra time, and it'll continue to increase even after 4 months, but that's kind of the reasonable threshold if we can wait that 3 or 4 months to really unlock a lot of that digestibility.
So when we talk about grass, and I know the people really like on podcasts when I talk with my hands, but I can't help it, right? We have these like linear kind of lines that where we have quality versus quantity, right? And as our quantity kind of goes up and we see things get lengthier and stemmier and stuff, then our quality kind of comes down because we see more of that lignin and things start to develop. We don't see that quality versus quantity trade-off as much with something that's in silage versus something that's dry hay, right? We're kind of, you've used the word unlocking. We're kind of unlocking components of this that maybe we wouldn't get. And so that's not quite as linear as maybe in a dry hay type system.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we still certainly, want to target those maturities. I mean, plant maturity is still certainly top of the list in my mind for a quality feed. But yeah, we have a little potential with silages. And the other thing is just we have, with the weather patterns we're having and stuff like that, silages we potentially need a narrower window to put them up, right? And that can benefit farms as well. So you could gain some quality just in the fact that you have the opportunity to harvest this within maybe a couple day window before a rain event's coming in, where if you were doing dry hay, you wouldn't be pulling the mower out that day if rain was in the forecast a few days later. So it it kind of gives us some more flexibility on that end as well.
And so outside of moisture, right, I've kind of got a cheat sheet over here, but we look at different moistures, but usually somewhere like that 60 to 70 range, right? We can kind of fluctuate a little depending on our storage or additives, and maybe that's a conversation for another day. But what other like key indicators do you look at for plant maturity when it's time to actually harvest? Or is that it? Just going out, doing a moisture sample and knowing it's time to run?
On the corn silage side, I continue to be a big fan of the whole plant moistures or dry matters to as an indicator. It is interesting to look at kernel milk line. That conversation has changed over the years, and I think that's an important detail. Is years ago there was a often referenced about using half kernel milk line as an indicator. Well, a couple things have happened. One, we prefer our silage a little drier now than we did maybe a couple decades ago. I mean, you read references from then, and it was more like I use dry matter, so 32, which would be 68 moisture, right? And um now we really would like to see it closer to 35 dry matter, 65 moisture. So half kernel milk line doesn't align. It may be aligned better with 30, 31, 32% dry matter. It doesn't align as well with 35% dry matter. And the other thing is that we have healthier plants, stay green genetics in plants that have changed as well. So that's where we shifted over to whole plant dry matter as a better indicator. But because of all these changes, I really encourage people to use both. Still target that whole plant dry matter in the mid 30s or mid 60s, however you want to look at it for moisture, but also look at kernel milk line but look more for like a 2/3 or even a 3/4 kernel milk line, not that half kernel milk line. And so from a corn silage standpoint, to me, those are the biggest factors. That's really kind of optimizing yield and nutritional value in terms of how much starch is in those kernels, as well as giving us a moisture content that's pretty favorable for the fermentation process.
So I'm guessing that this, by taking the whole plant moisture rather than looking at kernel milk line, also might come into play in years like this year where we have a lot of, at least maybe we were talking before this podcast started, that in your area it's been fairly wet all season. Well, we've been in drought for most of the season this year. So, I mean, there's a lot of folks that are harvesting their corn that was supposed to be for grain. Now they're harvesting as a silage because they don't have good pollination, good kernel fill. But then even corn that was to be used as a silage, I'm seeing folks I saw folks pull it out earlier because that corn ear phenology is not lining up with the moisture in the corn leaf tissue. And you're seeing, I mean, we had a lot of this year where the corn leaves furled up at night and the daytime. So in a year like that, how do we change how we think about that, and when do we make that decision, when to pull that off?
Yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, there's a couple things there. So in a healthy corn crop, if we're at 35% whole plant dry matter, that's really being driven by the ear. So if you, and we've done this where we've measured ear dry matter separate from the stover dry matter. And when you're at 35% whole plant dry matter, you might be 45, 50% ear dry matter. And that stover's still 20, 23, 25% dry matter. So the ear is driving that process. So in a year like you're talking about where you have compromised ears, maybe ears that were never developed properly or are smaller than normal. But you also have a stalk and leaf tissue that's been under drought stress. It right, it kind of throws our some of those metrics out the window, and we need to look at it. And I mean, we can ensile wetter feeds. They become harder to ensile. You need to do a better job. You want to hope there's still a fair amount of sugar or energy there for the bacteria to use to do the fermentation, but we can still have a successful fermentation on a little wetter feed. But um, in that sometimes that drought stress corn or frosted corn can be really deceiving because it looks so dry because the leaves are dead or frosted. But in reality, because so much of the moisture is still in the stalk and the ear itself, it's not nearly as dry as it looks. And that can create problems because then you get into a field and it's actually wetter than you thought, and it may not, it may present more challenges with ensiling. So yeah, with that drought stress corn, it's just this might sound silly to say, but it's doing all the stuff we're supposed to do, but maybe a little bit better, right? Because we have to be there's less room, there's less wiggle room, less margin for error when we're dealing with a crop that maybe isn't quite the right dry matter or doesn't have as much sugar in it, because that's an advantage of corn over trying to ensile like alfalfa or grass, is there's because of the kernels in a properly developed corn plant, there's more energy there for the bugs to use, and we tend to see it's slightly easier to ferment a corn silage than it is like alfalfa or grass. So if you take a compromised corn plant with ear that didn't develop properly, now you're making that process more challenging.
So one of the things that did come up this year is because we had some folks that were thinking they were going to be short on corn silage, and we had a lot of other grain producers that weren't really producing a lot of corn grain because that crop was also drought stressed. There was some trading going back and forth, right? And there's some pretty nice fact sheets on how you can price standing corn and make some estimates and stuff. But is that ensiling process different with something that's like a grain corn hybrid compared to something that would be a corn hybrid? Or is that, as long as your moisture's right, you're basically still at the same process?
Yeah, there's really not a big difference. We use a lot of what the industry often refers to as dual purpose hybrids for silage. I mean, there are some silage specific characteristics that some companies will promote, but ultimately most of those are, might be related to plant size, leafiness, or we already referenced the brown midrib trait for digestibility. But at the end of the day, they really still act the same and style the same. And I wouldn't change my guidelines really at all for that. It'd be more about if it's a compromised ear development because of an extreme drought or something, you're kind of dealing with a different product then, but not just because it's grain versus silage.
And that kind of goes back to what you've mentioned a couple times now about that grain sampling, right? If you're going to be going out and you're going to be doing some of that type of chopping, is that a really important time to consider doing that grain sampling when you're maybe going out and doing your neighbor's grain corn? Because your chances of supplementation may be higher then, or just do it on all of it. Don't even think about where it's coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, I would have those forage samples done on all of it. I mean, I get, again, if you're I keep kind of repeating the part about if it's a compromised crop, then presume if it's a if it's a relatively normal sized plant with a smaller ear on it, then your starch content's going to be lower, right? So understanding factors like that are gonna be important to you, but it would still it wouldn't change how I would approach it in terms of getting out there, getting those samples um and beginning to think about how you utilize that feed and recognizing that harvest is already kind of wrapping up, but to me another critical part of that is thinking about how you store this feed. So say you had some fields that did produce better because they weren't quite as drought stressed, different soil types or whatever, and it's a higher quality feed. It's always a shame to me if that gets buried in one big bunk silo behind a bunch of lower quality feed, because then you have to feed through that lower quality feed to get to the good stuff, right? And usually there's a we can find a purpose for almost any forage on the farm for different groups of animals, whether it's heifers or dry cows. So if we can store that separately, if we know we have some feed that might not be quite as good, maybe it would be really good heifer feed. But the key to being able to really utilize it is having it in an ag bag or a different silo or a different bunk, so that we have access to it and can utilize it for the group of animals that it makes sense for, and not be forced to feed it to a group of animals that it doesn't work well for just because it's all intermingled.
Yeah, sir, that's a good point too. If you have the ability, I mean, I have a lot of folks that are using bunkers, and bunkers are difficult. I think they're great for the ability to pack in a lot of material and get a lot of material harvested and set aside. But if you have a field that might be less than ideal, that's where maybe the ag bag would come in. That's maybe one way to kind of get around that. And you're right, the differing quality isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just needs to have the right kind of use, right? You might not use that for milk production, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, so one question before we move on from this conversation of varieties and the also the mostly the impact of conditions and choosing the right maturity for harvest, I do have one curiosity, one question about varieties. So BMR, I see a lot of folks using BMR, and it seems to me that in all of our conversations, you've kind of mentioned traits aren't all that important when we're talking about silage. It's more about the crop timing, the quality of that crop going in, and then your ability to ensile that properly. So is there a good use for BMR corn? I know I come from a pathologist background. I know I always go to those fields when I want to see disease. That's what I do. So I love it because I get to go find disease, but I also say I don't know about this. So what's your thoughts on those kinds of traits?
Yeah, you made a good summary there, Ryan, in terms of when we talk about more conventional dual purpose hybrids and the weather really driving a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, BMR is a really interesting thing. There's some very good research on it. I mean, it certainly will be higher digestibility. It still ranges, right? Because we could have a drier year where even our dual purposes are higher in digestibility, but the BMR is still gonna separate itself a little bit from that, right? Where we could have a year with really poor digestibility in all our dual purpose hybrids, and the BMR is going to be a little lower too, but still separate itself from the pack. So where's it fit? Well, it's really interesting. I mean, I've worked with a lot of farms that have tried it. Some have stuck with it and for 10, 20 years now, and others are try it for a few years and it's just not a fit for them. And I think that's a really important part of this is how it fits their system. So we know if you feed it to close up dry cows or early lactation cows, it can help stimulate dry matter intake. And, there's certain groups of animals that there's a more of a response to feeding it to those groups of animals than if you're just feeding it on average across your herd. But you do need more of it. So if they're eating more pounds of it, that's good because dry matter intake is correlated with higher milk production. But it means you have to have more tons of it to feed, and there is a bit of a yield drag. It's not as extreme as it used to be. We see better agronomics in the BMRs these days, so the yield drag's not quite as large, but there is still a small one. So you're going to feed more pounds of it per cow per day, and it maybe yields not quite as well. So you have to factor into how many acres you need to grow of it to utilize it, right? And then how do you store it on the farm? Back to the storage piece. If you have a separate bunk silo just to put your BMR in, just to feed it, and you're making separate TMRs for different groups of animals on the farm, then you can really dial in its use and take advantage of it. But if it's all getting mixed in your one bunk, and you feed a one mix to all your lactating cows, then you're really kind of diluting out the potential advantages of using it, right? And that's often where we see farms aren't as happy with the results, as if they're feeding one diet and it's all mixed together, you're just not getting the advantages of it because there is an agronomic cost to it. I mean, most growers I know that grow BMR, they just pretty much budget in a fungicide application every year. And you have that, slight yield drag. So you have to factor in those agronomic costs. And if you can really dial it into certain groups of animals and see the response in that group of animals, then yeah, you can probably justify the extra cost of growing it. But if you can't see that response and really target that group of animals, then you're probably diluting out the benefits while still having the higher inputs, right?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Thanks for explaining that because I was kind of wondering, especially not being an animal systems person, just what I don't quite understand the purpose of this because, like you said, the cost is higher and then the yield is lower. I know it's more digestible, but what does that mean? It's a good point that it's almost a supplement, right? And something that has a specific use case. And if you have a good use case for that in your operation, it could make a lot of sense. And that's probably how a lot of these traits work. You just need to kind of try them for yourself on a smaller scale, see how you like them, and then see how you can integrate it into your operation. One question now that we've kind of gone back to the agronomic side here, are there any other agronomic decisions that we haven't talked about yet that you think differs for producing a corn for silage versus a corn for grain when it comes to the planting time, how you manage that crop in the season? What are your thoughts there?
You had briefly mentioned relative maturity, and obviously, grain producers are really pay attention to relative maturity as well in terms of making sure that crop has a reasonable chance of reaching black layer, right, and drying down. But on the silage side, it's definitely a topic we've talked more about, and really encouraging farms to dial back their relative maturities a little bit in a lot of cases because we see some very competitive shorter season hybrids, and if it puts you in the driver's seat, so to speak, for harvest timing, so if you dial back that relative maturity a little bit, and that means it's going to be ready to harvest 10 days sooner, then you're more likely to have good weather conditions, not be up against the remnants of a hurricane um, or a frost event or something like that. And if we're in the driver's seat and we can wait for that 35% dry matter to harvest, then we're going to have a better crop and a more efficient harvest season. If we push our relative maturities too much to try to squeak out a little extra yield, but we push it too far, and now we're looking at the forecast and saying it's only 30% dry matter or 31% dry matter, but I'm going to start harvesting now because I want to get this in before the storm front comes through or something. Now we have a compromised crop. It's not going to yield as well because we haven't allowed that those kernels to develop. The nutritional value is not going to be as good. So that's a big one. And then the other one would be population. And we used to have some general recommendations on grain populations versus silage populations. I mean, usually silage is a couple thousand more plants per acre than grain would be, to optimize that as a silage. But companies have become so good at identifying the populations that work for certain hybrids that I really defer to them now on their hybrids. There's some more silage specific, like leafy type hybrids that with more of a flex ear on them that do tend to do better at lower populations. We see farms down in the 28-30,000 range with some of those. But if you're a dual purpose kind of corn, you're probably going to be more 34, 35, 36,000, something like that. But like I said, I'd really defer to the companies on that now because there's such a diversity out there. It really comes down to understanding the hybrid characteristics that you're working with and making sure you're dialing in the population for that hybrid.
Sure, because at the end of the day, you're talking about a silage product that's being chopped, and you're looking at it not each individual plant and the size of the year produced, but holistically. So different varieties that have different traits are going to respond differently to different plant spacing, I'm sure. So that makes a lot of sense. So I think we're getting close to our wrap up here. One thing that we had noted was inoculants, but I think we can leave that for another episode. I think that could be a whole episode on itself. So maybe we'll do that in the future. I guess wrapping up here, do you have any other major silage topics or concerns, things that can go wrong that you wanted to talk about before we closed up here?
Yeah, I think, as since a lot of the 2024 crop is already in, it gives us an opportunity this winter to kind of reflect on how it went and what we can do better next year. So, obviously we keep inventories throughout the winter to understand if we're going to have enough feed to feed the number of mouths we have in the barn. But it's also an opportunity to look at how we did in terms of density. So I don't think we actually really brought up density, but that's essentially when we're talking about getting oxygen out of silage, we need to pack it as hard as we can to remove that oxygen out of there, right? And tracking your inventory, especially if you have some sort of scales that you're, weighing the feed as you feed it out, so you know how many pounds you're feeding out, and using that to calculate what was your density in that space. So like in a bunk silo, you could put a mark on the wall and a week later come back and measure how many feet you've moved and compare that to the weights of how many tons you've taken out based on the scales on the TMR wagon or something like that, and start to calculate, did we achieve as high a densities as we wanted? I mean, and in the past, it was often talked about 14 to 15 pounds of dry matter density in a silo. That's really a minimum. That's not what our goal should be. That's really a minimum density to get okay fermentation. I really challenge farms to be 18 plus pounds of dry matter density, which is some people talk about as fed, or density at field moisture, and that'd be 48 or 50 pounds of density as fed. But I challenge people to be in that range, and if you're doing inventories this winter and find that you're below that, start making some plans of improving packing weight and looking at ways that you can improve that density for the next year. And then look along the walls. Are you having a lot of spoilage along the side walls? Are there strategies to change how you put the plastic over, or lining the walls with plastic to reduce, any water or air getting along the walls or the top and stuff like that. So I think looking at those things this winter, and if you identify them as being less than ideal, start thinking about how you address that for next year. And I focus in on bunk silos just because, as I think you mentioned already, Ryan, they're an efficient way to store a lot of feed, but they're also a very challenging way to store feed. So upright silos, ag bags, yes, stuff can go wrong with them, but in general, they are an easier way to manage feed. So we focus in on the bunks just because there more things can potentially go wrong. So we tend to spend more time on how we better manage that.
So there's a really nice Cornell fact sheet on maximizing quality in bunk silos that kind of goes through ways that you can measure your density. But one of the things I think that I see trouble with some of our producers, and you talked about the density, is kind of thinking these general rules of thumbs on tractor weight and delivery amounts. And like I've seen these numbers between 800 and 1,000 pounds of tractor per ton being delivered. And like most of us don't have 40 tons of tractor, right? Like, and
Mhm.
so, you have to be kind of careful, think about some of this and considering some of these things. And so this is a good time to check up that. So we'll share that, how you can measure those numbers and how you can kind of calculate some of that in these show notes. So if anyone wants to go back and look, it's a really nice fact sheet, and hopefully some people get some use out of it.
Yeah, and if you have I can provide a link too for the show notes of a little webinar that I put together a year or two ago. You can watch online, and that goes through some of that same stuff and some of our tips for good ensiling practices and bunk silos. So might be another good resource.
Sure. I think I have one last question. What excites you in the world of silage research, and is there a direction that you're excited to specifically go in your work and looking into more?
Yeah, so being on the extension side of things and really looking at how we apply some of this, I have already alluded a couple times to how kind of the growing environment affects the quality of the feed and especially like fiber digestibility, but I'm really interested in continuing to look at kind of ways we can better understand that and manage it. So we have a project that we started this summer, kind of building off the more conventional corn silage trials, where we're just growing a couple hybrids of corn. And actually we planted some alfalfa too, a few different varieties of alfalfa at multiple locations around the state, with the idea is, it's not a really intensive replicated research project, but it's more harvesting those same genetics grown across multiple different growing environments. And then what we're going to do is actually plug those forage analysis into a software that balances diets for a farm and show, like, if you had these same genetics, but you had these rainfall patterns and this number of growing degree days throughout the year, this is the resulting quality of that feed and how the diet's going to look like. And you could take those exact same crops, but grow them, 100 miles away where you had different growing conditions for the season. And this is how the diet's going to look like when you feed those crops and grown in that environment. And again, it gets back to that idea of we can't necessarily manage the weather, but if we can understand the impact of the weather, then we can use it as a planning tool for really dialing in and getting more efficient use out of our forages.
I mean, we see a lot of things in agriculture going into the precision ag space, and I think this is kind of another way we can kind of take all the data that we have available to us nowadays and find a way to use this for silage production. And you're right, there are a lot of unique conditions that we're dealing with every year. We're dealing with a lot of unique genetics, so it would be really cool to start to have a deeper understanding of that and use that as a tool moving forward. I think that would be really cool. Thank you, Joe, for coming on. I think we'll probably have to have you back at some point because I just scratched down a whole lot of ideas for other episodes that now that we have our inaugural silage episode, we can start to dive into really specific topics from here. So Joe, is there anything else? Do you want to plug any place that people can reach you? Maybe you don't want to be found, but if you do, somewhere they can reach you. We have some of your materials, like that video that we'll post as well.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. I'm kind of slow for on the uptake of the social media and that kind of stuff. So it's really just our PRO-DAIRY website where you can find my contact information and a lot of the articles we put out and some of our corn silage reports and stuff. So yeah, I'm always happy to receive feedback and get questions and calls and email. So you can find my information on the website there if you just Google Cornell PRO-DAIRY. Yeah, I've enjoyed this. Thanks for letting me ramble on a bit here, and it's been a good discussion. Hopefully, it's valuable, and would be happy to continue the conversation.
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been great. I think you're a wealth of information on this topic. For our listeners, we are doing another episode this week on looking at silage this season, silage quality and dry down. If you're interested in this topic, you'll probably be interested in that. So we'll put that out as well this week. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again on another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.